So my interest in the Mallee grew out of a growing interest in environmental history. With a colleague, Richard Broome, we decided to teach a subject in Australian environmental history. And the Mallee was a place where we could bring together a number of colleagues who were also interested in environmental history. It was a place with a very distinctive environment and also a place where the ecology of the Mallee, which is an ecoregion that is in disparate parts across southern Australia, and which we've started to term the Mallee Lands. So our interest in the Mallee Lands was both the ways in which this ecosystem that can be found in quite different parts of southern Australia was also subject to quite different settlement histories. The Mallee is also, particularly in Victoria, has a sort of history of being a place where there's been a lot of stories surrounding the great struggles that settlers had in trying to make a living on this pretty challenging landscape. So it's got a kind of iconic status, particularly, as I say, in the Victorian context. It's quite different in Western Australia, where it's known more as part of the wheat belt rather than the Mallee. But in Victoria also it was a very important place for soldier settlement, and the soldier settlement experiment, if we want to call it that, in the Mallee in Victoria was one that was pretty disastrous, and its cost in human and economic and ecological terms was massive. And so it presented a really interesting place to start to think about the ways in which humans and nature interact in a particular context. Very early in the history of Mallee settlement in Victoria, the Federation drought came along, as it were. And the Federation drought was a profound event in Australian history. It lasted really for about 7 years, and the worst period of it was from about 1901 to 1903 when it finally broke. This narrative that developed around the Federation period of what a Mallee farmer needed to survive and the type of person that he needed to be. And he needed to be incredibly resilient, resourceful, and able to adapt. And those qualities are qualities that still people talk about as being foundational to what a Mallee farmer is. One of the things about farmers is that they keep really good records. They have great records of, usually of rainfall in particular, often also of temperature. And many of them can say to you, I can show you, that the rainfall over the last 20 years has been 10% less, for example, than the 20 years prior. So they're able to track on their own farms what those changes have been and recognise that this means some significant challenges coming their way in the context of climate change. And some of the things that they're anticipating and are already happening are, for example, that they'll have later frosts. If you have a late frost, you risk losing your crop because, it's already the wheat's already in flower, and so you lose the crop. Or alternatively, you might get rain at the wrong time. So that's again not good for cropping. Or you get really dry periods, extended dry periods. So droughts become more frequent. Higher temperatures early, so early heat shocks. So normally in the Mallee it starts to get hot November, December, but a couple of years ago, for example, they had some really high temperatures in October, which wiped out, lots of cropping areas. So those are the kinds of things that they're starting to notice and that are already having an impact on the crops. What that means is that they have to think really carefully about what crops they're going to grow, what crops are going to be best suited to this changing climate. And they're also looking at the fact that wheat yields more generally on the long term are starting to decline. What does that mean for the future of farming in the area?